Hello and welcome back to Retro Ranger. Today we're going to talk about the Sega Master System. What's that, you ask? I'm always a bit surprised by the amount of gamers, even ones in the retro space, who totally missed out on the Master System. No judgment here, of course, though, so pull up a chair and let's learn about Sega's competition to the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is the Sega Master System. Okay, this is Sega's Master System, which launched in North America in 1986. Physically, it's very long enough that it actually won't fit in the standard Kallax shelving from IKEA, which is a bummer since that's what I use to store my game consoles in. The system will accept these credit card-sized games on what was called Sega cards, but it also features the more dominant and traditional cartridges that would plug into the top of the console. It runs the prolific Zlog Z80 CPU, it had 8 kilobytes of RAM, and would output a 256x192 resolution capable of displaying 32 colors. One notable feature is that the console has a pause button, and before you ask, here's the controller, which sadly has no pause button. No start button either for that matter, and one of the two buttons on the front doubles as the start. So yes, to pause the game or access an in-game menu, you had to go to the console and press the pause button there. Nintendo don't do that, and thank God they didn't, because this is clearly bad design. 4 years later, they would come out with this sleeker upgrade called the Master System 2, and while I very much appreciated the smaller form factor, there's some important omissions with this revision. First, there's no Sega HuCard support anymore, so any of those games that are on those will not play here. More importantly, and especially for those that are looking to get the best quality display out of your retro consoles, the Master System 2 only outputs RF, and gone is your RGB capable output from the previous version. As mentioned, the Sega Master System was direct competition for the NES, and even had similar accessories like its own light gun called the Light Phaser, and despite the superior technical capabilities, it still struggled to gain a strong market share, especially in Japan and the United States. The Sega Master System would go on to sell an estimated 10 to 13 million units worldwide, and had a significant following in the non-US markets, specifically like Europe. Let's move on though to the games. Alright, let's start this list off right with one of the most iconic RPGs, Phantasy Star. This was a game that Sega prioritized to compete with Dragon Quest, a game that was on Nintendo and had spawned a number of sequels, as well as the beloved MMORPG Phantasy Star Online. This first entry follows a female protagonist named Alice and begins the adventure after her brother dies at the hand of the solar system's ruler, and Alice swears revenge. Phantasy Star is impressive for a few reasons, but the two that really stood out to me are the theme and graphics, especially in the dungeons. The theme breaks away from the sword and sorcery that would come to dominate the RPG genre almost exclusively. Phantasy Star is futuristic and has strong sci-fi elements that really creates an amazing backdrop as you explore multiple unique planets throughout the game, which always felt a bit like Star Trek to me. I mentioned the graphics, and while the in-town graphics are nothing to write home about, the dungeons certainly are, especially for the time. The animation of the movement is equally as impressive, and it really highlights this game and the system. The battle system is face-on like Dragon Quest, Earthbound, and the like, and while I preferred the side view that you can see your avatars, this was common style at the time. Since the actions you take are selected from a menu, not being able to see which character you're taking actions as, outside of maybe just a name in the corner, is a bit disappointing when you compare it to some of the other examples. Speaking of characters, you're going to collect a few, including my favorite, a cat named Meow, and each of them are going to have unique offerings and skills or spells. Overall, this is a classic and a unique JRPG, and it's easy to approach since a version of it now exists on the Nintendo Switch these days through the Sega Ages release. Let's move on though to our next game. Of course, what early Sega console would be complete without Altered Beast? While this was an original packing game for the Sega Genesis, a copy was also made for the Master System, albeit pretty disappointing when compared. Have you never played Altered Beast? Well, you're dead, and Zeus, yes, the Zeus, resurrects you to save his daughter Athena. You can punch, kick, and kick up at enemies as they stream in from all edges of the screen. The main mechanic here is that you gain power-ups, and those will transform you, first into this super ripped dude, and then if you get powered up again in that form, you become the Beast. Your speed is faster, your attacks are upgraded, and the whole game goes from boring slow to super exciting. Punches become projectiles and kicks explode you across the screen at Mach 3, tearing up everything in its path. There are some other beasts available with their own powers, but since I'm not very good at this game, I don't usually get far enough to see them, and unfortunately each new stage you start over as the weakest form, and again the game starts to drag on, at least with my opinion. The boss fights are pretty cool though, and present some good challenges, but the sprite sizes typically associated with this game can be appreciated here most of all. Strangely though, these boss fights don't feature any music. Did they forget to add it here? Unfortunately though, the performance on the Master System leaves a lot to be desired, so definitely check this one out on the Genesis instead. Let's move on though to our next game. Alright, move over Mario, this is Alex Kidd, The Lost Stars. The action platformer here, based on the arcade game released 2 years prior, has you control Alex Kidd as you take on various and definitely unique levels. Your goal is to get to the end of each stage by avoiding the tricky landscape of pits and a plethora of enemies. While you're going to start out with nothing but a slight jump, there are few power-ups to be gained throughout the levels to help you progress. The first is the J block, which will increase your jump height and allow you to take some safer paths or just have some more time to react. Another power-up is the S block, which gives you the ability to shoot a projectile. This comes in really handy as you'd suspect, but they're limited, so it's a good idea to not go overboard until you can get a refill. There's also health refills which are labeled as SC, and I don't actually know what those stand for, so I'm probably missing something obvious, but either way you want to get those. Like the Adventure Island series, your health is tied to a timer that isn't explicitly shown, but it's best not to dawdle as you make your way through the stages. Speaking of stages, they're definitely unique and each presents a completely different theme. Some are in space, some are underwater, the first stage is a toy box apparently, and more. While I can't really make heads or tails about what's going on with the stages, I will say that they are bright and colorful, and so the game is inviting, and it would have likely been very appealing to their target audience as a light platformer for the system. The only real gripe I have is the physics, as they are a bit slippery, which in and of itself isn't a deal breaker, but the jumps are really floaty, even without the jump upgrade. I completed the game before I was even really comfortable with the controls, and that's unfortunate. Again, this is a good game, so don't let that deter you, but go in with the right expectations, as this isn't the smooth Mario physics that you'd hope for either. Overall, this is fun and it's entertaining, especially on the Master System, that shows off what the really good colors can do over its competitor. We know that graphics don't make a game, of course, but there is room for another platform, and especially on this system. Let's move on. Next up on our list is Cloud Master, which was originally an arcade game from Taito. This is a shooter or shmup that, as the name would imply, has you mastering the clouds as you ride it like a surfboard. Apparently clouds are much more dangerous than I thought because this one can shoot projectiles, though that comes in handy since the sky becomes a war zone quickly with enemies and their projectiles all over the place. While the theme is a bit unique, the mechanics are not, and they have the typical components found from the genre. You get power-ups to give your weapons more power or different attack patterns, which is still just as satisfying here to collect. The enemies all present a good challenge, and once you're hit once, you're fried. While I'm typically not the best at the shooters that can fill the screen with bullets, it won't be long before you know which enemies to prioritize taking down to prevent them from filling the sky with their projectiles. Some harder enemies will drop a door once killed, and like Phantasy Zone, this is a shop that you can enter to get upgrades, which will absolutely help. Each stage ends in a boss and hits a sweet spot on the difficulty, at least for me. Overall, I really enjoyed this game even though it looks like a bit of a budget title. If you're a fan of shooters, consider getting this one on your list. Let's look at another shooter on the system to compare. This is R-Type for the Master System. Chances are good that you've played a game in the R-Type series, as it's been going on since the original arcade game in '87 and still continues to this day. There's been ports of this game to pretty much every console, and that's not an issue, because this series is great, so I'm happy to cover the Master System port today. Originally released by Irem in the arcade, this horizontal shooter has you taking control of the now iconic R9 spaceship in an attempt to take down a hostile alien race, straight out of the Alien movie franchise. Even the original art cover wasn't shy about its movie inspiration. The levels continue to match that theme well, and it's your job to maneuver your way through the great level design and a slew of enemies that inhabit them. Like some other shooters, you're not allowed to touch the level itself, and doing so will cause you to blow up on the spot. Of course, to emphasize that danger, the developers include many enemies posted on the walls to make you get close enough to tempt fate a bit, but in general it's a welcome challenge. Speaking of enemies, there's a good variety that each pose different challenges on how to approach or maybe just avoid them altogether. It wouldn't be much of a shooter if you couldn't upgrade your ship, and there's a few ways to do that here as well. While some push the limits of the Master System hardware like this laser attack that's always fun to get, others are equally nice like this missile that will hone in on enemies. One of the more known upgrades is the Force. No, nothing with Star Wars. This is the ball-like device that you can connect to your ship, and it can also be detached at the player's whim. When attached, you get a weapon upgrade, and detached acts as another weapon source for your ship. Also, interestingly, the Force can be used as a shield, which can sometimes be fun to just ram things with. Overall, this game likely needs no introduction, and it's definitely considered one of the best games on the Master System. Despite I'm terrible at it, I can absolutely see the appeal and agree, it's a must-have for the console. Alright, it's time for some classic beat-em-up action. This is Double Dragon. As one of the most successful and early beat-em-up games, Double Dragon has really set the pace in many ways for the genre. The Master System port comes only a few months after the NES version, which could easily be considered one of the best offerings on that system. Double Dragon on the Master System, though, is a pretty faithful port in terms of graphics and stage environments, but the gameplay lacks a little bit when it's compared to the NES. Interacting with the enemies feels a bit like a coin flip on who's going to win, as enemies aren't really stunned when you hit them like you'd expect them to see in other versions of the game. I found myself jump kicking a lot, as it's the safest way to do good damage and also avoid trading blows with an enemy. That said, you really don't have to worry too much about damage, as there's apparently unlimited continues, which just kind of takes some of the fun away in my opinion. I mentioned the graphics, and that's worth double clicking on, as again we'll see that the trade-off of improved graphics at the expense of gameplay. It's frustrating because both were here, this would definitely be a definitive port. Either way, there's still fun to be had, and most of what you'll remember from the arcade will make an appearance. Picking up enemy weapons and using them on their owners is still super satisfying. If you've somehow not yet played Double Dragon, I suggest maybe Double Dragon 2 on the NES, but this will do nicely if you have a Master System. Alright, we really can't talk about the Master System and neglect to mention Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. While this game was originally developed for the Genesis, Sega did create an 8-bit version for its Master System and Game Gear, which we talked about briefly in our Game Gear episode. Being a later release in the system though, you can definitely tell it benefits from a few more years of experience, and it's delightfully smooth and enjoyable. Just like in the Game Gear and Genesis versions, Mickey must journey into the Castle of Illusion to rescue Minnie Mouse from the evil witch Mizrabel. Unsurprisingly, you take control of Mickey Mouse through the side-scrolling 2D platforming that is the castle's levels, and each of them are going to present a different theme and boss before you collect a gem and move on. The order of which you complete these stages is up to you, though there are some gating in terms of which are available at any given point. Mickey's controls are tight, and the physics will immediately click in your brain, which really elevates this title amongst its peers. The stages are all bright and colorful, which really pops on the Master System's color palette. The stage design is mostly good and consists of many nooks and crannies to stumble upon treasures, though sometimes it can be a bit confusing on how to just go forward and proceed to the boss. When you do get to the bosses though, it will typically be your jump on the head affair, but some will mix it up, like this chocolate bar that is very much resembling the Yellow Devil fight from Mega Man. Bosses will feature typically one attack mechanic and thus won't present much of a challenge, especially if you've already played it previously, but that's not to say that there's lacking fun here either. Overall, this is a great platformer game that also saw a remake on the PS3, which too is worth playing, but don't think that just because the game was originally made for the Genesis that the Master System version isn't totally worth checking out as well. Okay, next up we have a sports title. This is Reggie Jackson Baseball. Okay, I have to admit it guys, I really do enjoy these early baseball games. There's something relaxing about kicking back and playing a good game of baseball with simple controls. Unfortunately, Reggie Jackson Baseball won't quite make that list as it stumbles in a few spots. What works here though is the good graphics, some cool scaling-like effects on the ball, and overall smooth performance that could culminate in a great baseball title. Where it shoots itself in the foot though are some of the controls and some music choices. To be clear, the music when you're waiting for a pitch is fantastic, but the camera switches then when you field and base run, and this music is just awful. It sounds like a siren for some reason. It gets old really quickly, and that's a shame because it's unnecessary to switch the music at all. I know they wanted to create some sense of urgency, but this wasn't the way to do it. The controls are almost identical to the classic RBI baseball, but base running in particular is unintuitive, and I actually had to read the manual to find out how to just make my runners run, even when they were forced to from the rules. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not automatic. While this might seem like a small gripe, it just made you realize that the intuitive controls that you were seeking are actually in a different game, and you should probably just be playing that one instead. One really nice thing I can say is that it has a home run derby mode, and that's a lot of fun, especially if you just want to hit some dingers. Overall, this is baseball. It's not the best baseball game out there, but between the two options on the Master System, this is definitely the one to get. Let's move on though to our next game. Next up, we have ourselves a racing game. This is Hang On. You've likely seen Hang On in the arcades, as it was one of the first to include a motorcycle prop to ride on and control your character on screen. It was also a massive hit in the arcades, so of course it was coming to the home consoles. Sega included Hang On as a pack-in for most Master System package bundles, so it definitely saw a lot of play. It was also well received at home, though in retrospect it's not one of my favorite of these raster-style racers. It was, however, featured in Shenmue as a playable arcade game, so if you missed it originally, perhaps you played it there. If you missed both, the concept is nice and simple. You've got limited time to complete each leg of a track before moving on to the next stage. Your motorcycle has 3 gears that you need to manually control based on speed. The 2-button controller will handle the gas and the brake, which will be required as your bike controls pretty poorly at high speeds. To make matters more difficult, the slightest touch will make your motorcycle explode, which to me at least seems a bit aggressive, but you know, hey. Throughout the tracks, there's checkpoints to extend your time, and one aspect that I like is that if you run out of time, your bike can actually drift into a checkpoint and it will still award you the extra time, which I feel is a nice add. The game's simplicity hasn't aged well, and you'll get bored pretty quickly, as the stages don't offer a ton of variety outside of the time of day. The tracks are also a bit too long for their own good, and I think players would have felt a better sense of progression had there been more tracks and just less checkpoints, especially when they're all pretty much the same either way. If you're in the mood for some classic throwback, this might be a good option, though I'm guessing you'd be better off without. Let's move on. Next up is Ghouls and Ghosts. What hasn't already been said about this fantastic side-scroller? Like with other ports of the game, you again pick up the lance as Sir Arthur. Your job is to make it through the stages and the castle to save the soul of your princess. And that sounds easy, but of course this game is notoriously difficult, so let's see how it stacks up on the Master System. Arthur can throw his lances in the orthogonal directions, including down, which will really help clear the screen of pesky enemies. There's always a balance right with this title between progressing the screen and clearing certain enemies before they become really problematic. There's bosses at the end of each level, and these feel great on the system, and it's just satisfying to take them down. Even outside of the bosses, the art in general is good, and the music lives up to the other installments. The difficulty is retained, and it's still 2 hits and you're dead, but the physics are good here for the most part, and makes it at least fair. Where the physics appear to fail though is in certain jumps. Specifically this stage, where I just can't for the life of me make this jump. It feels dang near pixel perfect, and it's easy to run off the ledge as well before jumping just to try and squeak out that extra pixel of platform for the distance. I must have tried this at least 30 times. This difficulty isn't fun, and I was disappointed to hit it. Perhaps the answer is just get good and I need more practice, but either way, outside of these silly jumps, it's largely Ghouls and Ghosts that you've already played probably, and that's a good thing. Let's move on. Alright, this action RPG is called Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap. As you'd guess, this isn't the first Wonder Boy game and is part of a larger series from Sega, but this is the first one to make it to home consoles and the only one to land on the Master System. You take control of Wonder Boy, who is attempting to lift a curse which transforms him into Lizard Man. And to do that, he's going to need the Salamander Cross, an item that will remove his ailment. Over the course of the game, the form of Wonder Boy will change and his abilities will swap out with it. The game is interesting in a few ways, but definitely carries a Zelda 2 vibe in that it's a non-linear action RPG, which will have you exploring the world and exploring dungeons alongside. Even in the beginning, you're going to be greeted with a puzzle as to how to proceed and will include some backtracking. Thankfully, in doing so, you'll be greeted with some of the best graphics on the system. These environments are all colorful and fun to explore, and as mentioned, exploration is definitely going to be a component here as you'll have to figure out where to go. Along the way, there'll be enemy drops in the form of health refills and money, the latter of which can be used to buy equipment like armor and new weapons. Of course, to equip these weapons, you'll need to go into the menu, which means, yep, you've guessed it, going over to the console and pressing that pause button. The dungeons will feature a dragon boss at the end of which are fun to face off against, including the first instance, which just will transform you into the lizard upon doing so. While it's great on the Master System, it was recently remade on the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch, and generally faithful to the original. Either way, it's one I'd recommend for this system, and if you've not yet played it, I highly recommend to add it to your collection. Okay, and there's a look at the Sega Master System and a slice of the games available for it. There's still other great games worth mentioning as well, like Golden Axe, Ease 1, Space Harrier, and more. The truth is, there's a ton of good hits on the Master System that can largely go unnoticed if you're not paying attention. What about you all? Did you grow up with the Master System? Or were you even aware of its existence? If so, which games do you remember playing? Let me know, of course, in the comments down below, and until next time, as always, thank you for watching Retro Ranger.